Welcome to You Got Moxie, the podcast about the how of change making. I'm your host, Julie Ann Crommett, and on today's episode, we welcome Kamala Avila-Salmon. When we interviewed Kamala, she was head of inclusive content at Lionsgate. She now has her own production company with a deal at Lionsgate, Kas Kas Productions. She shares her journey as a disruptor and a change maker in the film industry. She emphasizes the importance of taking up space and making an impact, starting with a specific moment in high school when she ran for senior class president. She discusses the challenges she faced introducing inclusive content at Lionsgate and introduces us to StorySpark, a tool she developed to spark creativity and facilitate conversations about inclusion in storytelling. Also, she and I are both proud alumni of the Kumbah Singers of Harvard College. Welcome, Kamala. Oh, Kamala, we are so excited to have you here. Welcome to You Got Moxie.
Thank you so much, Julianne. I am thrilled to be here. I love the name of the podcast, so I can't wait to dive in.
Oh my gosh. Well, we're so glad to have you here. And so, where we like to start with everybody is sort of for you to share a little bit about yourself, for folks at home to get to know you. And if you could, as part of that story about your life and your journey, maybe reflect on a specific moment where you knew change needed to happen, positive change needed to occur. And what was that moment like, and what happened for you in that moment?
That is a great question, Julian, and I would expect nothing less. So, hi, everyone. I'm Kamala Avila-Salmon. I am a native of Jamaica. I grew up in New York, and I live in Los Angeles right now. I work in the film industry at Lionsgate, heading up our inclusive content team. And I like to think that I was kind of a natural disruptor and change maker. I was definitely raised in a household where my parents really taught me intentionally and sometimes unintentionally to never take no for an answer and always argue your point. And I think one of the things that, I'm trying to think of the earliest moment where I was like, something needs to change. I would say in high school, I was the quintessential, run for everything, be in everything. And I remember when I was running for senior class president. And, I had all these big ideas of things that I wanted the school to do. And I remember when I was working on my slogan and my campaign, and I'm putting together my posters. And I don't know what it was. It was I had some very specific things that I wanted our high school class to accomplish. And I always had the feeling of if not me, who? And why not me? And I remember articulating that at a very young age and having friends who were like, well, don't you feel nervous about being out in front? Or don't you feel worried that people might feel this or that or the other? And for better or worse, I never worried as much about that as I worried about not taking up space, not having an impact, just being in the background and having to go along to get along. And so I feel like that has just been a running theme of my life that has come up again and again. When I was an intern at various places, I always wanted to stand out and do something that would matter. And I remember working at a record label in A&R, and they had a drawer of all of the demos. This is back when people sent them in physically, of songs that people never listened to, right? Oh, I want to get a record deal. No one ever touched it. And I happened upon it and I was like, what if there's someone great in here? And they're like, there never is. And whether that is or isn't true, I was like, but someone should listen to make sure, right? So I came up with a whole demo submissions log, and I listened to everything, and I talked to the chairman about it, and that's just the type of person that I am. And I just feel like was a very early lesson from my parents that if you're in the room, take up space and make an impression.
Oh my God. I love that. By the way, I've known you a very long time. So for everybody who's listening, we have known each other for an amount of years, and share a lot of background, including being Caribbean. What?
Yeah.
And I love this concept around the take up space. And I had no idea about the music record label experience, that you were like, wait a second, no, we're going to dig through the pile and I'm going to create a system to dig through the pile.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And it's funny because some of our other guests have sort of reflected on this when I ask them the next thing I'm going to ask you, which is when you're, sitting and you realize there's something to do differently, that something can be better, right? More positive, more equitable. It can sometimes feel overwhelming, right? Because there's the systems we live in are huge.
Yes.
There's so much to do. There's so much that needs to change. We feel it right now, I think, in a very visceral way in America and in the world. And you kind of ask yourself, where do I start? Where do I begin? And a lot of our previous guests, and even in your example from the music industry, you sort of, begin with something that was sort of right in front of you,
Yes.
in a way. And so I'm wondering, what's your advice when, and think about maybe another anecdote you could share where you had to decide where to begin, and how did you make that decision, and what were the different factors that you thought about when you were making that decision?
Yeah, I mean, I'll use a very recent example, and it definitely exemplifies how I've approached change overall. Like, I totally get the feeling that, like, once you start thinking about what isn't working well, it feels like, well, actually, almost nothing is working well, right? As you start to sort of like, well, there's this thing, but then there's like, oh, there's the thing under that thing and the thing under that thing. And that's when you get into the systems and like the overwhelm starts to creep in, right? And you're just like, well, if I can't fix everything, then like, what's the point of starting? And I never start from that perspective. Right? The idea that, just because I can't do everything doesn't free me to do nothing is like really, really an anchoring truth for me.
Can you say that again? That is worth saying one more time.
Just because I can't do everything, it doesn't free me to do nothing. Right? Like, I can't just say, well, throw up my hands, like it's too hard, right? I have to do my little piece. And so the example that I'll use is when I started at Lionsgate in this role of head of inclusive content, right? It had never existed at the studio before. I was so excited, but I also was very aware that like at the moment that I was getting hired, right, we're talking the height of like post George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, summer and fall of 2020. And like a lot of these types of jobs were popping up. And, a lot of them didn't have any predecessors. There was no roadmap. And there was this feeling that like you are being sent into a raging fire with like 2 drops of water. Like, what can you do? And I remember thinking like, the first thing I wanted to do was define what inclusive content even was. And I didn't want it to be just sort of like whatever the Black woman that they've hired says it is. Right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Because there's the feeling of the like sort of the magical Negro, the magical Latina, the magical Asian person, right? That just by virtue of your identity, you know all the things and you're just going to help us be better, right? And it's better at what, right? And for what length of period, or do you even know the problem you're trying to solve? Right. And so in an effort to define that, I came up with a framework, which we'll talk about later, that later became, has become StorySpark. But it really was the kernel of the idea of like, how do we define what inclusive content is? And I was like, to do this work, I need to have a definition that I can point to that feels objective and repeatable. And I thought about what are the things that people talk about when they say, this feels so exciting for a community or a culture. And what are the things when people are watching television or watching a film that make people say like, this feels a little like dated. This feels like trite. This feels tropey. This feels stereotypical. This isn't interesting. I'm not excited. It's inauthentic, right? And figuring out what are the common themes that show up in those conversations with academics, with consumers, with leaders, and like really sort of quantifying and drilling down to like people are usually talking about a consistent set of factors. They're talking about what is happening on camera and like on the screens that we can see. They're usually pointing to what is happening behind the camera, the writer, director, the producer. Tropes and stereotypes come up a lot. Like the Bechdel test comes up a lot, the DuVernay test, like what are the things that people are always talking about? And can we put them together into a consistent framework? And having that be the first thing that I ever did as a team of 1, and that I really started to reinforce as a team of 2 when I got an assistant, getting the full studio buy-in of like, these are the 5 or 6 things we're going to look at on every single film. Do you understand why we're looking at these things? Mm-hmm. Agree that these are important things. And if we could do well at these things, we would feel better and prouder of the content that we made. And then also we would feel like it has a chance to be more commercial and more relevant to bigger audiences because basically you're not pissing them off left and right.
Right.
right? By being incomplete or not thoughtful or not creative, right? It doesn't mean that like we've solved all the problems, right? It doesn't mean that the only scripts that get made are the ones that StorySpark says is amazing, right? But it gives us a framework of conversation. And to me, that's just an example of like starting with like one thing and then having that one thing build into other things. Okay, now we have a framework. Okay, now we have a process on top of it. Now we have a place where the conversation happens. Now we know how to talk to filmmakers. Now we know what we want to greenlight. Now we can talk about it. All those things were built after that, but starting with like literally a blank sheet of paper and being like, if I don't want inclusive content to just be whatever Kamala says is inclusive, how can I like really distill for myself and to others what it is we're talking about?
Amazing. And I think there's something really powerful in what you talked about in defining the problem or the opportunity, as we like to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Defining what is that opportunity and making sure we're all, whatever that team is that's involved, is aligned and clear on what that opportunity is and the why behind it, right? And that is so real and it's so tangible to start with, right? Like you don't have to get to the frameworks and the solutions and everything else that you all came up with. You started there, right?
There, yeah.
And I think it's really powerful because you actually then manifested that into an actual tool, which you mentioned a little bit, StorySpark, but also because I want people to go check it out after they hear us today is, could you talk a little bit more in depth about StorySpark, what it is, how you use it, and maybe connect that dot of how it manifested from these questions and this framework, and this focus. Yeah.
Totally. So as I said, I mean, it was one of the first things I started working on, right? And it had a totally different name for a very long time, right? But basically what it was is I was like, I wanted us to almost do like a forensic analysis on every single project that the studio was working on to make sure that we didn't miss anything when we were thinking about making things more inclusive. And I also wanted it to be sort of like, when a project comes in, the creative execs read it and they make a bunch of notes about a lot of different things that they believe will make the story better, right? The characters need like stronger motivations. The protagonist isn't empowered. I don't believe the storylines, like the world doesn't feel lived in, like all of those things, right? And I was like, we can do something similar around inclusion that feels just as intuitive and just as repeatable, and really start to implant in people's heads a different and additional set of questions that they should ask themselves as they're developing, right? And I remember as we started introducing it and we, week after week, when we were in our, content evaluation or greenlight meetings or development meetings, bringing this framework in and talking through what these elements were, you could see how it started to shift the conversation and invite people to also put their lens on in terms of like, do you think the female characters are empowered? Right? Are you noticing that the characters of color don't have agency? And I remember the meeting where we were reading a particular script and one of the white male execs in the room said, I really feel like you've ruined script reading for me, because as soon as I read it, I was like, this is a white savior story. This character isn't working, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, I never used to think like that. And I was like, well, did I mess it up for you or did I fix it for you? Right? Because you should have been reading for that. It was always there, right? And so StorySpark really is the manifestation of all of those conversations really distilled into a product that people who aren't in the room with us can have on their own, right? It is absolutely like, we think of it as like a BuzzFeed quiz type of approach, thinking about inclusion in a holistic way. Right? Regardless of what your background is, we all have gaps and things that we don't see as clearly because they're not our perspective, right? And I don't want people to feel like, well, that means that if I'm a white man, I can only tell stories about other white men. Sorry, this is the best I can do. It's like, no, it's not the best that you can do, right? Because you live in the world with other people, right? And you can ask yourself a set of critical questions. And if you're willing to be honest in the answer to those questions, whether it's like, tell me about the diversity of the characters that you were putting together as written. Forget casting for a minute, right? What did you write on the paper? Right? Because sometimes, we can write in ways that people would describe as like neutral or race blind, right? But very few things are. Most things are written white as neutral, straight as neutral, able-bodied as neutral, all the way down, right? Usually gender is written into a script, but sometimes we even use this tool to have the conversations about, does this have to be a man? Like, just want to ask, right? Like, could it be a female character? And if it
Right.
is, what other storytelling opportunities might present themselves if it was, right? Does every Black character in this story have to not have a father? Like, just why, right?
Right.
One of them might have a great relationship with their dads, right? And just how do you start to unpack some of the unspoken assumptions that the script is carrying with it, and just getting people to take that pause to be like, okay, there are women in the story, right? Are there any scenes where women talk to one another, not about a man? Because you and I, Julianne, have had plenty of conversations, and most of them are actually not about men.
What? Really? Is that real?
Like, who would have thought, right? And it doesn't
shocking.
It doesn't mean that women don't have romantic interests and sides of their lives, right? But it's not the only thing they talk about.
Right.
Characters of color don't only serve to support white characters, right? I'm the main character in my story, right? So where is that main character energy for other characters of color and people from other marginalized groups? So all that to say, like, what I'm excited about is that we've come up with this quiz that in 12 questions can take you through any piece of material that you are working on, whether you are a producer on it, a writer on it, a studio exec, or a production exec. You read the script, you bring that knowledge to it, and you answer the questions. And if you're willing to be honest and have that conversation with your collaborators and have them take the quiz too, you'll find a lot of really interesting ground to then develop your story to be something that feels more authentic. So I'm sure we'll drop a link, but it's very easy. You just go to getstoryspark.com. And I would love for people to make this their sort of creative assistant along the way.
Absolutely. And what I love about how you have posited the whole thing, Kamala, which is really powerful, is this idea of asking questions, right? And this came up with another guest we have as well, which is there's a real power in just asking more and more and deeper questions. And also, does that not just make the creative better at the end of the day? I mean, because we know characters that are deeper and more well-rounded in general will outperform and connect better with an audience because they're more specific.
Right. It's something that we know in storytelling, right? It's correct. Why actors and writers, like an actor will be like, well, what's my character's motivation? Even if they're only in one scene. Right, they'll come up with a whole backstory of like they grew up here and this happened to them, and that's why when they're in this scene they're so angry because, do you know what I mean? And like, so we know that, and that's part of why we called it StorySpark, because it really is about sparking a more creative story. It's not about checking boxes. It's not about being woke. It's about sparking imagination and the imagination of your audiences to think more deeply and be more sort of the opportunity to be more deeply moved by a story.
Absolutely. Because our role as storytellers, it was a quote that was either, and I talked about this in another episode as well, that was either from the New York Times book review or the New York Times newspaper on Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And something they said about that book, the reviewer, was it changed the weather in their brain. Mm. And I just love this expression because I think is great storytelling changes the weather in somebody's brain to create the conditions for different thoughts and different beliefs and questioning to happen. And so we as storytellers actually have the responsibility to do the same exercise that we are asking the audience to do. And I think that is treating the audience with respect. And if you learned anything early on, which I'm sure you got this same lesson early on in your creative journey, was you should never disrespect the audience. And I think that, to me, what you have built, it just builds into that so deeply when you think about our sort of profound role as storytellers and the expectation that we should set for ourselves if we're expecting the audience to do the same exercise,
I love that so much. And I think that like what you said about questions and the connection between questions and curiosity and creativity is so profound. And a lot of times, what people will find when you start going through StorySpark, some of the questions are more objective and some are really subjective. And that is not a bug. That's a feature. right? Like you're supposed to have a robust conversation because maybe one person on the creative team thinks that these characters are totally empowered, and the other person, maybe someone even from the group being represented in that character, is like, this person's not empowered at all. It doesn't mean that they're right and you're wrong, but it means you guys need to have a conversation about that.
Right. Let's have some healthy dialogue, right? And I think the dialoguing and creating health in that dialogue is so powerful because goodness gracious, do we need StorySpark for our whole society at the moment is what I would say.
If we're willing to be in dialogue with one another,
correct,
to ask questions and listen to the answers even when we disagree with them and still find a way to collaborate with that person on something that's meaningful to us.
It would be, it's a crazy notion, really. I mean, like the idea that you don't invalidate somebody else and their experience in a dialogue where you disagree. And I think this is a powerful part actually of change making, really, at the end of the day. And when we reflect on things, I'm always curious. Things don't go smoothly most of the time when you are trying to change something that's been one way and you're trying to move whatever it is to be different, right? Yeah. And I'm sure we have folks listening who have run into challenges or run into walls and been like, gosh, how do I figure my way through this? Or how do I keep going? So my question for you is, when you've been faced with a challenge, whether it's with StorySpark or another anecdote you have, how have you thought about that? And how did you meet that challenge, that obstacle, whatever it was, to either keep going or to maybe pivot or refine if that was what it called for?
No, I think that's such an important question because when you are trying to do something differently, you are going to face resistance. We were working on a project when I was at Facebook. We were trying to build an internal facing campaign about microaggressions in the workplace. And when I tell you I have never worked on anything more political in my career, like that was the one. Like this project was almost killed probably 7 times on the way to getting out. And we attracted the ire of any number of different groups, right? Any number of different groups, including people whose titles you would assume would make them our allies, were also adversaries, right? It was too honest. It was too authentic. It was too hard hitting. We were using actual stories that employees have. We were really calling a spade a spade. And when I tell you, people were like, absolutely not. Like, it was shocking, right? And I remember during that project, a mentor that was working with us on it said, things that matter are hard. And it's just like, duh, but you know that, right? But you don't internalize that, right? You think when you're working on something important and you see the value that it has to the world, everyone's just going to love it because obviously this is better, right? Absolutely not. And so it sort of shifted something for me in terms of like, when I'm working on something that's truly meaningful, I should expect no along the way. That's sort of par for the course, right? And like, I was always trained to like never accept a no from someone that can't tell you yes. Right? Yes. The people who actually were in charge of saying whether we could or we couldn't, ultimately, right? That's not usually who we were talking about. We were facing roadblocks from all the people along the way to that person and X, Y, and Z. And sometimes you take the feedback, and there were absolutely things that we took and we pivoted, right? We never said, never mind, we won't do it, right? Sometimes the feedback was given and it was so stark that you're like, you're fully expecting me to just say, never mind, it's too hard. What you don't know is I laugh in the face of hard, ha, 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 right? I'm like, you said no, that is so cute. You really think I'm not going to come back, right? I remember like we wanted to do something very focused on Black and Latinx experiences, right? And I remember when someone was like, but I mean, don't you feel like you're invalidating all other marginalized groups if you just make it only about these 2 groups? Obviously, no, right? We were telling a very specific story. But did we come back with 5 other chapters and said, great point. So here's the chapter on women. Here's the chapter on disabled people. Here's the chapter on queer people. Here's the chapter on people that are older in their careers. So on ageism, and I don't think anyone was expecting that we were going to be willing to do 5 times as much work. But I was like, game on. So now what's the reason why we can't do it? And I actually think that that was a pivot that was really meaningful, right? Because it meant a lot to all the other communities too. It doesn't mean that we were wrong to want to do something that would have singled out these 2 particular groups in this particular way. We totally could have done that. But if we had decided that we were either so offended or so overwhelmed by the feedback that we were never mind, then no one would have been able to get the message. So never take a no. I had someone's dad say no is just the beginning of negotiations. And I never really knew how much I needed to hear that until I heard someone say that. And I was like, yeah, no is just another word.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I used to say this to somebody on my team a lot when we were facing hurdles, actually in building the Launchpad program at Disney.
Yep.
And so I used to say to Maheen, my team member and a dear friend these days, I used to always say to her, no, it's just a step on the pathway to yes. That's it. Yes. It's just a step to yes. That's all. Is. And so she would come back from legal and go, no on the way to yes. And that's how we would talk about it,
100%.
Yes.
That is true. Anyone that has ever built anything significant, whether it is on a small scale or a giant scale, can tell you stories about all the no's along the way. That is the one consistent thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a quote, it's a magnet that's on my refrigerator from one of my dearest friends from college that I have kept since college that says, those who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those who are doing it.
Yes, I love it. I love that.
And I think this is the energy here, and I think the other part that really sticks out from your story as well is that there was a team. It wasn't just you. And I think change is a team sport, like life being a team sport. And I thought that was another powerful insight within the story that you told.
You have to have people that you're building alongside, and you have to have all different types of allies in the work, right? Some of those allies are in the trenches with you doing the building. Some of those allies are not in the trenches with you, but sit in certain decision-making spaces, or even just certain spaces of influence, or even just certain spaces of relationship, right? And how are you building that army of people to move forward? Because if we don't want the change to just be temporal, it needs to have other people that also are just as committed to it as you are.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And, it's the other reflection with that from what you said is from A League of Their Own. Gina Davis famously says, well, it just got too hard. And he says the hard is what makes it great. And to your friend who said if it were easy, everyone would do it.
Literally, everyone, we would have done it already.
You would have done it already. It'd be done. We wouldn't even be having the conversation.
No.
And so, I just want to thank you so much, Kamala, for these reflections. And I always ask everybody to end on the note of how do you keep going on your day-to-day? What inspires you? What fills your cup to give you that energy and to bring you joy in the work of change making?
I would say 2 things. One is I have a certain sort of inner certainty that the things that I'm fighting for are actually correct and that we've already won. And I think in the moments where it feels the darkest and the hardest, in the work that I do around inclusive content and championing audiences and really being committed to inclusive storytelling as the future of our business, I am 1000% committed to that. And I'm 1000% convinced of that. We will not have an industry if we continue to keep underrepresented groups out in a meaningful way. We see it again and again in the box office, in the viewership. It is the one thing that is constant. And so even when I'm facing opposition, I'm well, they're probably fighting so hard because they know I'm right. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that keeps me going. And then the other thing is having meaningful, things that you do to escape and release. Like the moments when I felt burnt out is the moments where like I realized I wasn't giving myself adequate time to like take a weekend off and just watch mindless TV, right? And no, I have like a million scripts to read, but like I can't this weekend, right? Like connecting with my son, hanging out with my husband, like gabbing with my girlfriends, like going on trips. I love traveling, right?
Yep.
Taking my birthday off and like making every birthday a big birthday. Like I'm going to Palm Springs with a bunch of friends. Like every year I'm like, let's do something fun, right? Having a bunch of trips lined up. I think you have to have things that are not connected to the mission and the work that make you smile and make you feel human and make you feel like replenished. And then when you're in the work, you're single-minded and undeterrable. Like I can't be pushed aside on this agenda because I know that it is the future of our industry if we hope to have one.
1000% cosign, my dear. And Kamala Avila-Salmon, we cannot thank you enough for coming here today, sharing your insights, your tenacity, your heart, and that incredible strategic brain of yours, and sharing with us different ways to think about change making. Thanks for joining us here on You Got Moxie.
Thank you so much. You have the most moxie of almost anyone that I know. So I'm so excited and honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully we'll have you back in the future.
Would love it. I have more moxie.
I love it. Moxie every day, everyone. Bye. Thanks again for joining us for You Got Moxie. If you're interested in using the StorySpark tool, visit getstoryspark.com. Continue to follow us and listen to your favorite episodes at collectivemoxie.com. That's collectivemoxie.com. We're excited to see you next time. Take care.